Hi, so I'm Daniel, and this is the first session of a series of coding videos for the software testing course. And today we're going to work on a small problem called the Rainfall programming problem. It is a classical problem where you write a program that will read in integers and output their average. You should stop reading when the value 99999 is inputted. And we're going to do this by writing test first. So it's more or less TDD programming. And we're going to use PHP and a framework called PHPUnit. So in PHPUnit, you need to name your files specifically, so they need to end with test in order to become a test case that can be found, and they should extend the test case class that is part of the framework. You can read up on this on the PHPUnit documentation, and you run these by running the you download a FAR file, which is more or less a PHP archive, and then you run PHP on that, and then you say that, okay, I want to run all the tests, and it says that there is no rainfall class right now because I have cheated a bit and started. So, but what we're going to do is more or less that we're going to say that we're going to go to red and we're going to work on this problem. So the first test, I say that there should be a main file, or more or less a method called main. And I'm actually going to keep this in more or less red, and going to add new tests when I add functionality. So the first test that I'm going to write is something like this. So let's call class Rainfall, and I'm going to say that it should have a main method. More or less, we're going to work on this method much later, but for now I just want to say that it should exist. And I don't have a rainfall class right now, so let's include that one that doesn't exist. Now you run the test and they fail. They fail because of a programming error. So, and that is actually red. So if I have a programming error, then I'm in red, which is the first step of test-driven development. We start by adding a test, and that test should fail. And then I go to the source folder, and then I create a file called rainfolder.php, and then I run the tests again. And we say that we can see that we get an error, and the error is that we test main should exist fails because the class rainfall not found, because I have still not created that. So let's create a PHP class rainfall, and let's go further. So I'm still in red, and I still get an error. There is no method called main. Public function public static function main. Problem with static functions like main here is that even if I wanted to, they are pretty hard to test, and we're going to talk about that. So you can see that now the test main should exist, succeeded in a sense, but failed in another sense. We can see there was a risky test. It says this test did not perform any assertions. So and the problem is that what do you assert when you run the entire program? So I would say to start in this and in a TDD project is really hard. We could do it, but we need I think that we should start more easily. So let's create another, let's start in another end of this problem. So somewhere in this program, we're going to read in integers and output their average. So let's start with that sub-problem instead. So let's say that we have some kind of class. I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to call it numeric array test. And I'm going to copy paste that. Numeric array is the thing that I want to test. So and pretty much I want to create a class called numeric array that takes an array of integers and can output their average. So test. Let's call this test get average. And usually I think that PHPUnit requires me to use test in the beginning of the method. But otherwise, I really like to write my test case names like this. Get average should return 0 on empty array, something like that. So and the name of the test method is a part of executable specification. So pretty much this says that a specific method should do something when under some stimuli. So let's create a test case, and if you remember, so test cases had input, they had a system under test, they had an expected output, and they had an actual output, and then we had some kind of comparison. So let's begin with the system under test, and the system under test in this case, I name that sut, create a variable, and then I assign that to new numeric array, and we input an empty array into that one, like this. And next step is that we input something, and this is really the input, since we create an array and we send things into that. We send a PHP array into the numeric array in its constructor. So the input is part of the same thing. We could, to make it very clear, we could write like this: an empty array. And that is the input, and then expected equals 0, so we would expect the average of an empty array to be 0. And then we want to have the actual value, actual equals, and then we exercise the system under test, which means that we run the method that we want to test. And then we, let's say, get average. And then we do a comparison. And now I need to know how to compare things in PHPUnit. So let's take a look at their documentation. Assert equals, and sometimes, yeah, so the expected should be first, expected, and then the actual as a second parameter. Sometimes you can add a specific text string or something like that to that name, to that test, so that if it fails, it shows that that specific text string. So now, since these are pretty much in the names of the variables, then it's self-documentation. So test get average should return 0 on empty array, and it inputs that's empty array. And let's run that test. So we run the test on that one, and I think we're going to do it like this. So it says that require one, so it fails because of the files does not exist yet. So now I'm going to green, and the first thing I'm going to do in green is to make the simplest implementation that fulfills all the test cases I have. So let's create a new file. Let's name that file numeric array. Let's create a class numeric array in that. Let's create a public function construct that takes an array but doesn't really do anything with that. Then function gets average, and then let's say that it should be should it be an integer? Yeah, it should be an integer. Get average, and then the simplest implementation of that method is this: return 0. So now if I run this, you can see that I still have that risky test, but the other test succeeded. So I think I'm gonna comment out this risky test for now, because it will disturb the test output. So you can see it. Okay, perhaps I need to comment out the entire class, because I want to be able to see, yeah, like that. So now I only have one test, and I only get one assertion. So so now I'm in green. So now I should refactor, the refactor step. So the refactoring could be simple things like improving the quality of my code, like that. So I just perhaps I remove some redundancy. If I have some redundancy, like right now I'm not really using this class, so perhaps it's better to delete that class. I don't particularly use this class either, so let's delete that one, and let's delete that one, and just keep the things that we actually have done. So now they don't disturb us. We can easily create those classes later. If you want to, you can always like commit these into Git. And I mean, when you're doing assignment 1 part 2, you commit all the time, so you have everything, so you can delete things and then find them on a later occasion. Okay, this one perhaps should be removed, but I know how I'm going to use it later. So okay, so that was refactoring. So now I would do a git commit again, and let's add a new test, because that is the next cycle of TDD. So public function test, let's say get average, should return the first item for single item arrays. Void. So I mean that is a simple test. So let's say that we have one item in the array. Now I can copy paste this, and more or less I can just add a single item. Let's add something that's super simple, 1 into that array. Now it goes into this one, the numeric array, and we would expect the output to also be 1. So the expect get average yeah, return the first item for a single item array. Okay, it's yeah. So that was simple. So now I run the test again. I see that I have failures. That means that I'm in red, which means that I can go to green again and I can work with my code. So let's do that. Now I could have something like, now I have a relationship with this one and this output here. So in order to accomplish that, I think that private values need to be something, so I keep the values, and in PHP I need to write this values equals input. Let's ignore that. Values. So if count values equal 0, then return. And then we have the other case. So I'm playing a bit stupid here, and there is a point to that. I'm just returning the first item. So if there are items, if the counts are 0, then let's return 0. If there are items, then we return the first item, more or less. That is what the test says, so that is what I do. So I don't try to be smart and implement the correct implementation here, because I don't have tests that are ground enough for that. So now both my tests succeed. So let's go to, that was green. So I would commit a green commit. Now I will do some refactoring. So pretty much I can clean up a little bit in this method. So I think that is enough. And over here I would like to perhaps refactor this code also. You can see that there are things that are similar to between this one and this one. Actually, there is a way of doing this in PHPUnit, but I'm not super interested in that, because I want to show you something that in order to minimize the test suite and minimize the effort working with this, we should make sure that we get specific helper functions. So we do this like create private functions, and this is not called test in the beginning. So let's say get average, and I will call it assert get average, something like that. And let's say, I mean, the things that is different is the input and the expected value. So let's call the first one input, and the second one, I mean, input should always be an array in this case. And the second one is the expected output, and that is always an integer. Expected. And then I copy paste this code into this one. And the input is already called input, and the expected is already called expected. So I keep that one. And then instead of running these, then I will fix it like this. Input was the first parameter, expected was the second parameter. So something like this. So that was more or less my refactoring. So let's run that again, and I run the code again after refactoring to make sure that I didn't destroy anything. So I removed some duplication during my refactoring. So let's commit that again. Okay. So what if we have an array with 2 items, you say? So let's say that we have an array with 2 items. So let's create that test case. Public function get average should return the average of 2 items. So okay, so let's input 1 and 2, and we would expect it to return 1.5. We run it again, and it succeeds. Why does it do that? Yeah, I think we might run into a small problem. This is a floating point. The expected value in PHP does not, I mean, now the average of two integers can be a floating point, right? 1.5. But this is actually hidden here, and I was not really expecting this to be hidden. So I think this might need to be a float. And I was expecting this test to fail, and I can work on the test until it fails, or until I'm happy. So 1 matches, let's say perhaps 1.0. I think that was the 37 and 30. 30 was this one. Assert equals. Yeah, get okay. So perhaps that didn't matter, but get average here needs to return. So this one should not return integer, but a floating point, right? A floating point has decimals. So now I have 3 tests and 1 failure. So failed asserting that 1.1 matches the expected 1.5. So since our implementation returns 1.0, then this one fails because it really does not compute the average. To make my point, I will continue to play stupid when I'm implementing this system. So let's say that we do something like this. If it has if count 2 items, then we return the average of those 2 items. And then the average is the arithmetic average 2.0. Something like that. So now I'm in green again because all tests succeeds for the right reasons. And now I should do my refactorings. So I think, I mean, these are all the same, and perhaps we could look at the data-driven tests that PHPUnit allows for. But I think this is fine because I really like that these tests have these names. On the matter of refactorings, we can see that this code here in the implementation is not super nice anymore. We have multiple if statements. For the sake of the practice, I think that we might want to keep this for another round. So pretty much the only refactoring I did was to add a space here, a white space, so that it looks nicer. But I think that, yeah, maybe something like this could be a simple refactoring. So num items like this. If number of items is 0, if number of items equals 2, and perhaps else would be also be nice, else if it's 2 and something like that. I think that is enough refactoring. So then I run the tests again and they succeed, and then now I have the opportunity to add yet another test case. So let's add 3 items. So the average of 3 items. 1, 2, 3, and I mean the average of that is 1 plus 2 plus 3 divided by 2.0. So let's run that, and I get 1 failure still. So yeah. So I think that is this is a quite nice way of showing that if I add enough tests, then I might start to need to like do the implementation within the test cases, because if you have enough tests, then you're starting to like need the implementation when to produce the expected values from the input. So I think this could be pretty nice, and I think we're gonna like stop the charade. So one way would be to add another if statement here, else if number of items equals 3, and then you add up to all these. But this is pretty much messier than actually adding a short for loop. So let's have a running count. Total equals 0. Let's remove this one also. Total equals 0. No, we want the number of items. So we have the total divided by number of items. And let's say that let's do it this way, because we're going to get divide by 0 error by doing this. So I think, and then for each, let's go through the array, and we don't need a key, we need the value. Total plus equals value, like this. So we replaced the code that we had there before, and we counted the number of items, and we had a sum method, and then we sum all up the items, and then we let's call it total sum. Now I'm starting to refactor things just because I'm talking about it. So let's run the tests. And the nice thing here is that get average should return the average of 3 items. I got a 2. Oh, I didn't expect that one. And but I expected this one, division by 0. But I didn't expect this one. The division by 0 error, there was 1 error and 1 failure. So an error is when we get a compile error or runtime error, and then we have a failure, and that is a failing test. So I expected this one, division by 0, because I have 0 items and divide a total sum of 0 with that one. But I didn't really expect the 3.0. Yeah, so now I know. So the count here is an integer. It's always an integer. So when you divide a number by an integer, then you get an integer division. You should always be wary of this. So PHP float val. I think it's called float val. Yeah, it is. There is a method which you can get the floating point value from an integer. So let's divide by that, and now the will that solve things for me? No, it didn't. So it's easy to get confused. So let's see what this can be. Certain that 2.0 matches the expected 3.0. This should be free. And why does it return 2? I think you can always dump the total sum. So in the this must be the output, right? So the total sum becomes 3. But why? Shouldn't the total sum become like 3 here and 6 here? I'm taking a short break so that I can think. Okay, that was stupid. So more or less, in order to find out what I did wrong, was that I borrowed some variables just by writing out total sum and see that it becomes 6 and see that the items is 3, and then I realized 6 divided by 3 is 2. So and I mean the actual calculation is correct, and this one was wrong, which is pretty fun because I said it was a good thing to write it like this. Okay, so that should probably do it. So we still have the division by 0 error that I expected, and this shows that in order to go to green you must fulfill all the test cases. So let's take a look at what we can do to go to green here. So if we have the special case, if number of items equals 0, return 0. And then we went to green, and now we can go to refactoring. So let's see what we can refactor. Let's take a look at perhaps number of items, total sum. I think that pretty much looks all right. Perhaps I'm gonna add these because I really like to have those. Then I think this looks quite nice. And let's take a look here, and we have these. Okay, so I think the I'm taking a short break. Okay, so now I have found the documentation for PHPUnit and where they use something called data providers. So a data provider is more or less a way of solving the extra the duplication here. So let's take a look at what they have here. So they have a specific comment above the test method, and they have a test method which takes a couple of parameters, and then the parameter then they use that parameters to assert things. And then I have another method which must be public, and I'm not sure if it needs to be called addition provider. Must be public and either return an array of arrays or an object that implements the iterator interface. Okay, so pretty much it must return an array. So that way I can refactor my test cases and remove some of the duplications. And in this case, you can actually have different indices in this array which have different meanings. So I think that could be a nice refactoring for us. So public function array average provider, and then it returns an array, and this one return, no, we're not so used to do that, like that, and then the first case is 0 items with 0 return. Perhaps we can just do it like this. Should return 0 on empty array. I think that. And then, since this is a string, I can actually have the and let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is how you index things in PHP. I know it looks horrible, The first parameter is array, the empty array, and then the second parameter is 0. So let's try out this one on this first method, and they write it like this. Data provider, average provider. So let's try that one, and then the input and expected should come as parameters to this one. Not be provided like that. Test get average, and then without the input. Okay, let's try that one. This is going to be interesting. Never done that before. Okay, syntax error. 46. Yeah, I probably need a semicolon after that one. Yes. Oh, nice. So now I can add the other cases also. Let's have this one should return first item on. So let's just equals array, and it was an array with 1 in, right? And then I can just remove that test case since it's implemented with the others. Should return the average of 2 items. 2 items, comma, and like this. And the expected value was 1.5, comma, should return the average of 3 items. So one could say that since it's so easy with this data-driven test cases, in order to, perhaps we keep this one just as a reminder for me to be more careful when I write tests. Since it's now so easy to provide test cases, perhaps we can even do it like this and remove this private function. I think that could be a nice thing. So now I screwed up again. 27. Let's make this a widescreen. Let's see if I can spot the error. 927. Input expected. An equal sign. Did I miss an equals? Yeah, there we have an equal sign. Nice. Okay, let's run that again. And then a parenthesis. Did I miss a parenthesis? 29. Yes, this parenthesis. So it's quite important to be careful when you copy paste things, but at the same time the test suite makes it easier for me to be careless when I program. I can just rely on the test to solve this thing. So now the test run, I have 4 different test cases. They are minimalized in the way that they are now just arrays of inputs and outputs for the same test case. And I sort of like this data provider thing, especially that you can have this string so that you don't lose the self-documentation of these test cases. Okay, one could argue that we should add more test cases now that it's so simple. Why don't add with 4 items or 10 items or something like that? I think that you should be quite careful not to create unnecessary test cases that you don't need. So what could go wrong in this implementation? Instead, you should think, what could go wrong in this implementation that you have? And in this case, we have the case where we have 0 items, so we go down here, and we have 1 item, so you do this once, and then you go down here with 1 item. You have 2 items, you do this twice, and then you go down here with 2 items, and then you have 3 items, and so on and so forth. So I think it's quite fine, the implementation that we have now, and does not require more test cases, so to say. So I'm done with that. So that was the refactoring part of that. But now I think this video is like 40 minutes, so let's cut it and continue with another one.